Well, we've been looking at this section of Deuteronomy that we're calling Laws to Love God. And we've looked at the general call to love God and to serve Him and to rejoice in Him. And then last time we looked at the specific call to remember that God has a place where He will be worshiped and where sacrifice will be offered. And then in chapter 13 of Deuteronomy, Moses changes the subject and seems initially to be talking kind of strangely. And we read there at the beginning of Deuteronomy 13, if a prophet or a dreamer of dreams gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or wonder that he tells you comes to pass, and if he says, let us go after other gods which you have not known, and let us serve them, you shall not listen to the words of that prophet or dreamer of dreams. And as we read on in Deuteronomy 13, what we'll discover is that what Moses is really talking about is thinking about who is going to lead you in worship, or more particularly, he's warning them against people who will lead them astray in worship. So what the beginning of Deuteronomy is about is a warning not to listen to people who are trying to lead you astray from worshiping the Lord alone and leading you into idolatry. So once again, we come back to this recurring theme in Deuteronomy. No idolatry. Do you get that? No idolatry. And it's said here in a really fascinatingly pointed way. There were prophets from time to time in Israel. And there were true prophets from time to time in Israel. But lo and behold, anytime there are true prophets, there are also false prophets. And Moses is giving them a test to recognize true prophets and false prophets. Now, when we get to the middle of Deuteronomy, at the top of our step pyramid, we'll see that Moses says one of the tests of a true prophet is if he says something and it comes true, then that's a sign he's a true prophet. And that's one test. But here he's giving another test, a test that almost seems contradictory. Because here he says, if there's a prophet and he gives you a sign and a wonder. Now, what does that mean? If there's a prophet who really performs miracles, Moses isn't going into how he performs those miracles. He's not raising the question, are they real miracles or false miracles? He's saying, in effect, let's grant for a moment the guy performs a real miracle, and therefore seems to be able to be a true prophet with power, able to say what's going to happen, and then it happens. If we only had that test of a prophet, we would say, well, if a prophet comes along and performs a miracle, he must be right. But Moses here is preparing us and adding another test, and he's saying, it doesn't matter how powerful a prophet seems to be, if he wants to lead you into idolatry, you're not to follow him. If he has miraculous powers, it doesn't prove anything if he's leading you against the Word. And what Moses is really saying here is the Word is always the primary test. Power is not the primary test. The Word is the primary test. And so no matter how powerful the prophet seems, no matter what miracles he may appear to be able to do, if he's leading you against the Word, and particularly if he's leading you against the faithful, proper worship of the one true God, you are to reject that prophet with all your heart. And that's a really important point, isn't it? Especially in our day, because again, in our day, we have people who claim to be prophets, who claim to be able to speak for the Lord. And our test of them always has to be, in the first place, not are they powerful, but are they faithful to the Word? And our Lord made that point as well. Mark 13, verse 22, again, perhaps with Deuteronomy in mind, we don't know for sure, but certainly in the spirit of Deuteronomy, Mark 13:22, Jesus says, false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders. Just the phrase we find in Deuteronomy 13, to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be on guard. I have told you all things beforehand. Now, we could almost say, Jesus is saying, but be careful. This is the constant call, that there are going to be people who set themselves up as teachers of religion, and they're dangerous, and don't listen to them. So if we're tempted to be led astray by false prophets who have power, who else might tempt us to lead us astray? Well, verse 6 of chapter 13, the second category of leaders we ought not listen to. If your brother, the son of your mother, or your son, or your daughter, or your wife you embrace, or your friend who is as your own soul, entices you secretly, saying, let us go after and serve other gods, which neither you nor your fathers have known, some of the gods of the peoples who are around you, whether near you or far off from you, from one end of the earth to the other, you shall not yield to him or listen to him. Family and friends lead people astray. That's what Moses is saying here. We love our family members. We love our friends. We want to have that connection and fellowship. We don't want to see barriers drawn. And so Moses is absolutely right, isn't he? This can be the most kind of subtle and dangerous way of compromising our faith with the Lord. You notice he says, if these family members speak to you secretly. You know, the false prophet is a public figure. The false prophet stands up and he's influencing many. But now Moses says, even in the most intimate of relationships, if there's a secret communication to become an idolater, you have to resist it. You have to resist it utterly. You have to resist it thoroughly. You have to put these family members to death. Wow. I mean, not personally, but that's what the law calls for. This is how serious it is. And one of the ways of seeing this is that false religion in Israel was somewhat parallel to what we would think of as a public health issue. If there's a bacterium, if there are bacteria, and it's a serious problem, what has to happen? The bacteria have to be eradicated. And that's sort of the idea here. False religion, idolatry, is not only wrong, but it's fundamentally corrosive and corrupting and destructive. It has to be rooted out. That's what Moses is saying here. And that's the great struggle in the history of Israel. They didn't root it out, and it constantly ensnared them, it constantly led them astray. And once again, it speaks to us and says to us, we have to be careful. Now, there's then a third category of people to watch out for, beginning at verse 12. If you hear in one of your cities, which the Lord your God is giving you to dwell there, that certain worthless fellows have gone out among you and have drawn away the inhabitants of their city, saying, let us go and serve other gods, which you have not known. Worthless fellows, another category. Well, that should be easy, right? The false prophet may be a subtle deceiver, family members may be a difficult deceiver, but worthless fellows, we'd all know better than to follow worthless fellows, wouldn't we? Well, apparently not. Apparently not. And worthless fellows is actually almost a technical term for a really thuggish group of people. Really bad guys in a kind of organized way. And it's more than just juvenile delinquents. It's committed bad leadership. And it's the same phrase that's used at the end of Judges, in Judges 19 and 20, with the horror of what happens in Gibeah of Benjamin and the slaughter there of a concubine. And that's all led by worthless fellows in Gibeah. And then Israel says to Benjamin, you have to destroy the worthless fellows. You have to destroy the city that followed them. And that is said really because of what's said here in Deuteronomy chapter 13. That's the obligation, to destroy the worthless fellows who have been leading us astray. And there in Judges, the people of Benjamin refused to destroy Gibeah. And the consequences are tragic for Benjamin. And all of this, you see, is an illustration of how when you don't keep the law of God, terrible things happen. There are terrible consequences to that. And that's illustrated there at the end of Judges. What's intriguing, of course, is that Judges has a special reason for including that. And the special reason is, do you know? Have you figured this out? The special reason is, who is born in Gibeah later? Saul. Saul is born in Gibeah of Benjamin. If Israel had done what it ought to have done, according to the law of God in Deuteronomy 13, then there never would have been a Gibeah for Saul to be born in, and Israel would never have had the suffering that it experienced under a false king like Saul. The whole book of Judges is kind of an apology for the coming of David. If Israel had had a White House, we might say that somebody in the White House wrote Judges for David to justify his kingship. But of course, that's not just a political plot, it's the truth. It's what God is inspiring, it's what God is helping people to see. But you see how all these things hold together in this amazing way. Deuteronomy 13 really helps us understand Judges 19 and 20, which helps us see the necessity of King David and how God is overseeing all these things and leading his people as well as warning his people. So at verse 18 then, at the end of chapter 13, we're told, if you obey the voice of the Lord your God, keeping all his commandments that I am commanding you today, and doing what is right in the sight of the Lord your God. Doing what is right now, not in your eyes, but in my eyes. So this is the law for the coming day, when Israel will have this place of worship, where Israel will be a faithful people, where Israel will follow faithful leadership, and that enables Moses now to talk about how we worship, in chapter 14 and following, how we worship. So he's talked about where we're going to worship. He's talked about who we're going to follow in worship as leaders. And now, how are we going to worship the Lord? And the first point that he makes there is a very powerful one. Deuteronomy 14, you are a people holy to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. As you approach worship, as you approach the questions of how we're going to worship, you have to ask, first of all, who are you? Who are you? How do you understand yourself as you come to worship? What is your relationship to God in worship? And Moses is making 2 points. You have to see yourself, first of all, as children of God, and you have to see yourself as holy. Holy in the sense of set apart. You're not like the world. You're different from the world. You're separated from the world. And at the heart of that separation is your realization that you're a child of God. It's often been said, and rightly said, God is not often called Father in the Old Testament. He's very occasionally, but not often. And it's really the practice of Jesus speaking to God as Father that has raised that sense of intimacy with God that is the privilege of Christians. But there is this profound sense in the Old Testament that the people of God are the children of God, which of course implies that God is Father. And this is a beautiful picture of that relationship we have with God. And therefore, because we are his children, we need to be separated to Him. Families sometimes experience that. If children seem to be more devoted to another family than to their own mother and father, that can be upsetting. And that kind of illustrates for us what God is saying here. We need to be a people set apart and a people who are holy. And then that helps us understand that sentence I skipped in verse 1 of chapter 14. Moses says, "You shall not cut yourselves or make any baldness on your foreheads for the dead." Now, see, that's what we expect in Deuteronomy. Just random strangeness. Just random strangeness. You are not to cut yourselves or make any baldness on your foreheads for the dead. You know, what's going on here? Well, actually, it's an elaboration of what we've already been reading. You're not to follow pagan ways of living or worshiping. And one of the pagan ways that is being explicitly rejected here is that some of the pagans, when someone died, would express mourning by cutting themselves or by shaving part of their head. And, you know, we do have mourning practices, don't we? We live in a world now where almost nothing is certain or reliable or standard, but it used to be that close family members, when they lost someone, would wear black. That was a sign of mourning. Sometimes they would even drape black cloths in a home, maybe over the mirror or over the clock. That was sort of to say life is just not going on the way it always did, and those mourning practices are fine. But here, Moses is saying, don't get caught up in the pagan mourning practices because it'll lead you on to all sorts of pagan things. And look how destructive those practices are. If you go around cutting yourself, it's a way of saying, to be sure, you're greatly distressed, but it's also cutting the body that God gave you. It's pouring out the blood in which there is life. These are practices that don't conform with the holy people of God who are to be set apart from these mourning practices. So even these verses that strike us initially as kind of strange actually are all part and parcel connected to what is saying here. And so that's part of what we find here. And it's actually kind of important because of something that will come later in the chapter. But he goes on then to say, and as a holy people, as a set-apart people, you are not to eat any unclean animals. And here then in chapter 14, we have one of the sections which is a background to Jewish dietary laws. The Jews are strict Jews are very scrupulous about what they eat and what they don't eat, because God has declared certain animals clean and certain animals unclean. And the distinction that is made here is a ritual distinction, a ceremonial distinction. God made all of these animals, didn't he? And he made them all good. We're told that in the creation story. He didn't make any bad animals. He didn't make any inherently unclean animals. But what God is doing here is saying to his people, I want you to be a people set apart, and one of the ways I'm going to set you apart is that you're not going to eat like the nations. I'm going to set you apart by insisting that you think about what you're eating all the time. You not only have to think about me and my word in terms of how you structure your day and your year and your travels, but you have to think about me as you structure your plans for eating. And so I'm telling you certain things are forbidden to you, that you might be a ritually holy people, a set-apart people. And it'll remind you and it'll remind the nations about this. There's a famous story that the Queen of England, Victoria, finally invited Baroness Rothschild to dinner at one of the royal palaces. This is the first time a Jew had been invited to dine with the Queen. This was a big deal. And When Baroness Rothschild arrived, she expressed gratitude for being invited and sat down at the table with the Queen, and food was served, and she turned to the Queen and she said, "Was this cooked in a kosher kitchen?" And the Queen said, "No, it wasn't." And Baroness Rothschild said, "Well, then I can't eat it," and smiled. Whatever we think of this, she was expressing that she was set apart. And she was not going to compromise who she was, even for the privilege of dining with the Queen. And so the Queen said, "What can we do?" And Baroness Rothschild said, "I could eat a boiled egg, because the shell of the egg will protect the food from being contaminated by an unclean kitchen. And I can remove the shell and then eat the egg." And that's what she did. Well, as I say, we can think whatever we want about that episode, but Baroness Rothschild was saying, I'm a separate person here. The law God gave me for what I eat, I have to keep. And it certainly was an expression both to her and everybody else how seriously she took this. And that's what God intended. Now, God also intended that these dietary laws would come to an end. We read about that in Acts, don't we? That Peter had a vision, that as he set out to be a preacher to the Gentiles, he didn't have to keep the dietary laws anymore because they had fulfilled their purpose. Not because they had been wrong for the time in which they'd been given, but the purpose of making God's people an externally separated people was passing away, because Jesus had come so that there'd be a universal holy people, holy now in commitments to Jesus and to his law. But these dietary laws then are important. There are some animals we eat, there are some animals we don't eat. Land animals, fish, birds, they're all covered. Certain kind of birds are okay, certain kind of birds are not okay. Certain kind of sea animals are okay, certain are not okay. Personally, I'm so glad I live now because I really like crab, but crab is unclean. So I wouldn't be able to eat a crab if I were in the Old Testament. But you see, it's all a test. It's all a question. Will you be careful? Will you be careful in the way you eat, so that you'll be a holy people before me? And then we come to one of the more intriguing verses here at the end of the not at the end, at verse 21. We come to Deuteronomy 14, verse 21, at the end of that chapter, where we read, "You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk." You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. That's a very important verse, which we don't have time to talk about now. So you'll have to come back next time to hear why this is a very important verse. But in the meantime, maybe you shouldn't boil a young goat in its mother's milk.